Hello everyone, and welcome to my talk, Recycling Roots in South Cushitic, an account of a prolific creative process. It's been observed that compared with cognates shared across other branches of Cushitic, the South Cushitic languages share comparatively fewer cognates with wider Cushitic. This has been often examined through appealing to language contact. The South Cushitic languages share fewer cognates with wider Cushitic because South Cushitic has borrowed forms from non-Cushitic languages including Nilotic, Bantu, as well as various members of the disparate group Early East African. This talk looks at another source of this mismatch, that being prolific word formation via other roots. Noted throughout Kiesling and Maus 2003 and examined in Harvey 2018, the South Cushitic languages share fewer cognates with wider Cushitic because a large volume of its lexical forms are based upon what I call here recycled roots. This talk provides a basic pattern for such word formation, displays numerous examples, and entertains some practical ramifications of this creative process. To start, I'm a linguist interested in the languages of an area called the Tanzanian Rift, their documentation and description, their morphosyntax, as well as the histories and cultures of their speaker communities. I work with 3 language communities in the area, roughly within the circle on the map inset, one of which speaks a language isolate called Hadza, another of which speaks a Bantu language called Ihanzu, and a third of which speaks a Southern Cushitic language called Gorwa. It has been Gorwa speakers with whom I've been working the longest since around 2012, and this particular image is of Gorwa consultant Raheli Lawi and I during an elicitation session in 2015 in Babati district. This talk will be focusing particularly on 4 Southern Cushitic languages, namely Alagwa, Burunge, Gorwa, and Iraq, each of which has its own histories, ecological settings, and language contexts. Time constraints mean that I won't be able to go into too much detail on any of this during the talk, but suffice it to say that these 4 languages represent the furthest south geographically of any Cushitic language, and all 4 exist in extensive contact with languages of the Bantu and Nilotic families, as well as Sandawe, which may be a far-flung member of Khoikwadi, and the isolate Hadza. No Southern Cushitic languages are currently in contact with Cushitic languages of any other subclade. To get an idea for what a South Cushitic language looks and sounds like, I'd like now to play a short clip of the story Takasir do Chuai, as told to me by Maria and Darbo Heike in Yerotonic Village in 2016.
Takasir do Chuai. Takasi kadu do hawatos. Takasi alo ina iyu tu do hawata khailaka. Iwawid khailaka. Ina ki'mar do indo babus. Hiyaw si der hiyasun dito kumamis walang tae awe. Ando ni'is wala tae awe. Hiyasin tae ay binaki ma'air kon. Ma'ing tu tan iwi de lonina in maleki kargar ma dora dola ani adi ma ke bardelo fakina urawa ke alo bern'ika dora dola hiyas maleki bolo dorina odasi ani bilita eda tinabe desi hari hoaros abaradawe.
It has been observed that, compared with cognates shared across other branches of Cushitic, the South Cushitic languages share comparatively fewer cognates with wider Cushitic, and one source of this difference, as mentioned, is due to language contact. That is, the South Cushitic languages share fewer cognates with wider Cushitic because South Cushitic has borrowed forms from non-Cushitic languages. So we can see here that the word for navel in the South Cushitic does not seem to have any likely cognates in the wider Cushitic. This is probably due to a loan from a Nilotic language. Here, though the data is a bit sparse, the word for mortar in the South Cushitic languages doesn't seem to be cognate with that in either Burji or Rendile. This is probably because it was borrowed from a Bantu language. Finally, the word for give off smoke in the South Cushitic languages doesn't seem to be cognate with wider Cushitic, but may possibly have been borrowed at some early stage through contact with a language or languages spoken somewhere in East Africa a long time ago, which Bonnie Sands and Mauro Tosco propose as early East African, and whose traces are visible in a group of geographically and phylogenetically disparate languages. As mentioned, these borrowing phenomena have played a significant role in the lexis of South Cushitic and have been the subject of a considerable amount of scholarship. In this talk, I'll be focusing on a different phenomenon, one which has received rather less attention and which has had an equally significant effect on the lexis of South Cushitic, that being the formation of new words from existing Cushitic roots. To begin, I would like to briefly explain the central mechanism behind the formation of new words in South Cushitic, using Gorwa as a representative example. This is a chart listing the nominal suffixes available in the Gorwa language. For our purposes today, what is important here is that there are a large number of suffixes and that they are present on all nouns without exception. And like all languages, Gorwa possesses a list of roots, which can be defined as domains of certain specific phonotactic constraints, upon which words may be formed. So in this case, the root tsir takes a suffix e, and the resultant meaning is bird, tsir'i. The same root, tsir, when taking the suffix o, forms tsir'u, meaning birds. The same process applies for all other roots. The root au takes the suffix u to form bull, au, and the suffix a to form bulls, awe. And the root qaf takes the suffix e to form shell, qafi, and the suffix o to form shells, qafo. Crucially, this kind of word formation is not limited to number distinction. Here, the suffixes e and eri turn the root tsifir into language, tsifiri, and languages, tsifireri, respectively. But when paired with the suffix ang, the result form tsifirang means a tongue. Moving beyond nominal suffixes, the process is also not limited to any particular part of speech. The root da can form the verb to sing, as well as the noun, a song. Similarly, the same operation applies to wa to derive the verb to vomit, wa, and the noun, a riverbed, wa'ang. Today we will be focusing on the kinds of examples on screen, that is, those that result in an appreciable semantic change. Take the operation which has formed to vomit and a riverbed from the same root. We can see here that not only is this pattern shared between the South Cushitic languages, in fact it is reconstructible to the shared predecessor language, West Rift South Cushitic, but furthermore that this pattern of to vomit and riverbed being formed from the same root is not shared by any of the other Cushitic languages of the sample. This suggests a lexical innovation that occurred exclusively in South Cushitic. A similar pattern can be seen in the nouns tongue and language being formed from the same root. Again, this is a pattern shared in two South Cushitic languages, Gorwa and Iraq, but not shared by wider Cushitic. This pattern is widespread, and here is not the first time it's been noted. Indeed, it is indicated throughout Kiesling and Mause's 2003 lexical reconstruction of West Rift Southern Cushitic. Here I'd like to give 3 examples from this work, along with some additional research from wider Cushitic, to show that these patterns can be seen as exclusive to South Cushitic. A first example from Kiesling and Mause 2023 is the shared root for the noun tooth and the verb to fasten in an upright position in all West Rift South Cushitic except for Burunge. The data from the wider Cushitic languages of the sample do not show the same pattern. In the second example from Kiesling and Mause 2003, a similar pattern obtains. In this case, the words white and new share the same root. And once again, this pattern is shared in South Cushitic and not in wider Cushitic. Finally, as a third example of this pattern noted in Kiesling and Mause 2003, we can see that the words ash and burn both share the same root, this time in only Iraq and Gorwa, and in wider Cushitic they do not. I'd like now to point out 3 further examples I came across in Kiesling and Maus 2003, but which were not explicitly noted in text. The first is that the word lion and the word big or fat shares the same root across West Rift Southern Cushitic, but not anywhere in wider Cushitic. As a second example, the word for dog and the word for hare also share the same root in Iraq and Gorwa. This is a bit harder to see, but it becomes rather more convincing if we consider the words for dog in West Iraq is se-ai rather than so-ai. In fact, and because of this relation to hare, I would posit that se-ai should be the reconstructed form here, and the contemporarily more popular form so-ai should be seen as a more recent pronunciation. Finally, the root is shared for both the word rat and the word for forest in both Iraq and Gorwa, but not in wider Cushitic. Looking a bit harder at some of the data can provide convincing insights on directions of semantic shift. For example, returning to one of the earlier examples, we can see that the root for fasten upright is probably cognate with the Rendile form for stand, whereas the word for tooth seems to share a cognate across most of the other Cushitic languages sampled. This points to the scenario in which the word for tooth in Southern Cushitic is the result of a semantic shift from the verb to fasten upright. A similar assumption on direction of semantic shift may be proposed for the pair forest and rat. As can be seen here, forest seems reconstructible back in earlier Cushitic, which would suggest a semantic shift from forest to rat. At this point, I think it's important to state that I am not trying to convince listeners that I think these patterns of semantic shift are exclusive to South Cushitic. Indeed, even in the existing data, we can see that other Cushitic languages of the sample have recycled roots in this manner. Returning to the slide on language, we can see that Bilin and Khamtanga use a word for language that is based on the same root for say. In Rendile, Dasanach, and Orma, language is derived from the root for mouth. And sometimes, even the exact pattern in Southern Cushitic is shared further afield. Here in Rendile, whale, the word for child, is seemingly cognate with wela, the word for to apply wet plaster. In Dasanach, the word for child and the adjective for wet or fresh seem cognate. Rather than asserting that this is a process unique to Southern Cushitic, I would like to show that the process is particularly prolific in Southern Cushitic. So here we can see a grid with each square representing one Gorwa word in a Swadesh 200 word list, supposedly a set of words considered basic and rather resistant to replacement. Squares in red represent Gorwa lexical items that have resulted from the semantic shifts described above, 14 in total. This is all the more striking when we remove pronouns and function words from this list, which results in about 8% of all remaining words being a result of this root recycling operation. Finally, a note on relative chronology is merited from the data as well. In the examples given above, we can see that some are shared across West Rift Southern Cushitic. Take, for example, here, for what I assume to be the word for riverbed resulting from a semantic shift from to vomit. Of the 8 examples, we can see 3 shared across all of West Rift. For one example of what we've seen above, the one showing the semantic shift from fasten upright to tooth, the pattern is shared between Alagwa, Gorwa, and Iraq, but not with Burunge. Of the 8 examples, we can see 1 that patterns in this way. Finally, we can see that the shift from forest to rat only occurred in Gorwa and Iraq, but not in Alagwa or Burunge. And of the sample, this obtained in roughly half the cases. If we assume the standard phylogenetic tree for the West Rift Southern Cushitic languages as given here, we might assume that the semantic shifts had taken place over a long period of time indeed, with each shared innovation occurring before the languages became distinct varieties. Alternatively, it may be the case that all of these forms were developed at a later date by the predecessor of Gorwa and Iraq and spread to Alagwa and Burunge through borrowing. Ultimately, these competing hypotheses could be tested by close examination of shared sound changes. Before I finish, I would like to acknowledge Raheli Lawi, Darbo Heike, and Martha Heike, all of whose images were used in this presentation. I would also like to thank Pascal Buu, Stefano Edward, Christina Guai, and Festo Massani, who served as local language researchers, as well as all the Gorwa people who contributed and continue to contribute to the research of their histories, their languages, and their cultures. Thank you, and here are my references.